Our guest, Dr. Walid Phares, he is the author of The Coming Revolution, Struggle for Freedom in the Middle East, and The War of Ideas, Jihadism Against Democracy. He is a professor of global strategies and the co-secretary general of the Transatlantic Legislative Group on Counterterrorism. He is also a Fox News contributor, Fox terror analyst. Dr. Walid Phares, welcome back. Dr. Phares, first question. Your response to the discovery or of hearing of this plot, the dimensions that we need to interpret, what's important here?
Well, Crane, first of all, even when you project that the Iranian regime and its allies have been penetrating our homeland, have been moving, into this hemisphere and have been in the Middle East for a few years now, advancing, even when you project all of that, when it happens, when the government informs you that there was a specific plot to set off explosions and an assassination in Washington, D.C., you cannot but be stunned. This is, you tell yourself, this is now happening. So in terms of the Iranian plot, I would say, number one, some in D.C. have been saying that because it was sloppy, because it was not what usually, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards and Hezbollah, do. They're very professional. Therefore, it may be a rogue group within the Iranian hierarchy. I disagree with that. I advance that the Iranian regime initially, knowing what we know about the way they advanced professionally and strategically, didn't want to sign the operation. Had it been Hezbollah or the Pezdaran doing it, that would have meant, after the success, if success would have been the case, that they would have been signing it, and that would have immediately drawn the reaction, the real strategic reaction of the U.S. and the international community. What may have happened, and we will wait to see the final investigation, is that the Iranian regime, and here I say on the other hand, it is the Iranian regime because there was that link that the Department of Justice has discovered for us between the individual and the two individuals and high-ranking officials in the Pezdaran. So it is the Iranian regime. They wanted to subcontract a segment from the Mexican cartel so they don't sign it. There will be the explosion, there will be bloodshed, because they needed that action to trigger other actions in the Middle East, and I will stop here.
Okay, so they want plausible deniability and not a direct connection to the to President Ahmadinejad. But in your estimation, am I understanding you to say that he knew about this and was aware and thereby did not stop it and, tacit approval of this?
Oh, it's more important than that. Let me share how it functions in Tehran. It's not that someone in the intelligence service decided to do a strike against the U.S. and the president may have known or not and allowed this to happen. That doesn't work like that. An action of this dimension, such as assassinating politicians in Iraq, the taking out of Prime Minister Hariri in Lebanon, remember, by Hezbollah, an Iranian ally, and other things around the world that including, for example, may I remind all of us that the Iranian intelligence service went after Iranian former prime ministers in Paris, and they assassinated Iranian politicians, opposition in France. So that kind of a decision, specifically, in the United States, in Washington, this is not something done by a sub-little office. This is a decision that goes all the way up to the heads of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, and of course to Khamenei, the head of the state. Now, of course, one would wonder, was Ahmadinejad in the loop? Yes, of course, because he's one of the 4 or 5 who, if there is an action of this dimension, he would have to know, because he would have to prepare Iran and the government for that situation.
Okay. With the thwarting of the plot, the stopping of the alleged attack, tell me, do you believe that the way we are treating this as a criminal matter is the appropriate response, and this is vindication of President Obama's policies when looking at the war on terror as being a criminal matter as opposed to an act of war? That's
a good point. But that's a point that goes back to what I call the original paradigm The administration decided 3 years ago when it started that it is not going to, number one, identify the ideology of the jihadists. Number two, promote the notion that this is a war, but at the same time act toughly and very tough with the leaders that they can hunt down, such as bin Laden or Awlaki or others. So when a action like this happens, you have A or B. A, you are in a war and you consider it as an act of war, and then you react in consequence. It doesn't have to be a military reaction, but you actually inform your public that this is an act of war by the regime in Iran. Or you would say this is a terrorist activity. We indict the Iranians for doing it, but we don't act as if we were at war with the Iranian regime. So it's a real political choice that was made, 3 years ago.
What statement does this send the rest of the world, not only in the fact of the most often used term brazenness of the attack? You mentioned crossing the red line, but also our response to it. And from what I gather, we are just going to step up with more attempts to isolate this regime, which has not worked in the past. Dr. Phares.
Yes, sir. There will be, as far as I can understand, more sanctions. There will be more international sanctions. It is very possible that the administration will take this to the Security Council, which should be done. It is also possible that the Russians and the Chinese this time will agree on some more sanctions. But if we don't cross back the red line on them, meaning if we don't work towards regime change or regime collapse, as we've done in Libya, or as we may do in Syria, if we don't do it with regard to the Iranian regime, it's not going to change much, because the Iranian regime has been able and will continue to be able to withstand all of these sanctions, because we're not basically working with Iranian forces, the civil society in Iran, to topple the regime.
Okay. When you say work through the UN, are you talking, I'm just thinking of Adelaide Stevenson going before the UN and talking about the Cuban missile bases, the Soviet missiles that were there and the pictures of them. Are we looking for that kind of moment of seeing this, not only this attack being connected to the Iranian leadership, but also the use of terrorism and other assassinations to make the entire case before the world? Is that what we're going to go with, or do you see that coming?
Well, first of all, I hope this would be the case. I hope the consensus in Washington in now our political times, this year and a half of political time, or year, we should have a unity between Congress and the administration on national security issues. That's very important. And based on this, I hope that the U.S., the administration, will go to the Security Council and will share with the world, with the members of the Security Council, the information that were already shared and maybe a little bit more, and demand that there will be a resolution leveled against the Iranian regime, with not just sanctions, but also demanding, actually, not just explanation, but to remit those persons who are responsible. That's how you begin with the process. As was the case with the assassination of Hariri. You just internationalize it so they could put pressure on Hezbollah to surrender those people, who were involved in it. And if somebody has sent, $1.5 million from the Pezdaran, from Tehran, we want to know who that is, because that's funding. And if somebody has given the instructions, we would like to know as well.
Dr. Phares, the overall response and what you've talked about, dealing with regime change inevitably, empowering these groups, you've outlined it in your books. You've talked about the enemy that we're up against. I guess the question has to be, President Obama, we have the killing of al-Awlaki, and in a memo that justified this, the legal examination or the response to it has been, okay, he's an enemy combatant, we're at war. And now we have this plot. Does President Obama need to address the nation to be clear and to outline specifically what war we're in and how we're fighting it?
Absolutely. Actually, this is the best thing that the president could do, is to address the nation in a speech on terrorism, on this confrontation. Not a speech just on when we're going to withdraw from, Afghanistan and, announcing those important facts that terror leaders have been dealt with, but to explain to the American public who is that enemy, how does it function, what is the doctrine. He doesn't have to go to the details, the principles. For example, when the president or American leaders say, this is al-Qaeda's criminal ideology or hateful ideology, fine. This is a description. We agree with that. But what is it about? What does it say? Why is it criminal? What does it say? See, if the president does that, what is going to happen is that finally in the States, in the United States, we're going to have a national security consensus that we haven't had for years, unfortunately.
Dr. Walid Phares, author of The Coming Revolution, Struggle for Freedom in the Middle East, and The War of Ideas, Jihadism Against Democracy. Professor of Global Strategies and Co-Secretary General of the Transatlantic Legislative Group on Counterterrorism, Fox News terror analyst, and our guest. It has been a pleasure. Thank you, Dr. Phares.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. On the flip.